Good afternoon. I'm Bob Corry from the Brimfield Historic Commission. Today we're going to be doing another in a series of interviews with local experts. Uh, and this series is being conducted jointly by the Brimfield Historic Commission and Brimfield Public Access Television. Today we're going to be interviewing John Curtis. John, would you introduce yourself?
I'm John Curtis. I'm 81 years old. I live at 24 Brookfield Road. I've been there for 50 years.
Okay, I'm going to give a summary of John's background before we get into the subject material for today. Uh, you're a graduate of Newton High School in Massachusetts and also Colby College, Waterville, Maine, with a degree in history. Okay, now most of your professional life, over 30 years, you've been a curator at various museums and other large facilities, historic facilities, especially Old Sturbridge Village. Will you explain to the viewers what a curator does?
Curator works with buildings and objects, seeking out those that are deemed to be suitable for the museum collections, acquires them, oversees any conservation or repair work that needs to be done, puts the object, catalogs them, puts the object either in storage or on exhibit. And curating is another word for taking care of. In England they call them keepers of this and that.
All right, now, in order to do this job, obviously you have to be an expert in, for example, Old Sturbridge Village, in building construction through various phases of American architecture and construction techniques, also the types of tools and equipment that people used in the 17th century, that is the 1600s, okay.
17th century is the 1800s.
The 1700, yes, go ahead and explain that. That's going to become important.
Right. The 19th century is 1800 to 1900. The 17th century is 1700 to 1800.
Okay,
The Pilgrims arrived in the 16th century.
all right. Now, we're going to be talking today about life in Brimfield for families and individuals, beginning when?
Beginning prior to the American Revolution and coming up as recently as the Civil War, the mid-19th century.
Okay. All right. Why don't you begin by describing how the town of Brimfield was formed?
The town of Brimfield, and this was not in America, this was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was an English colony. And the Springfield directed a group of people to lay out and survey a township to be the first one to the east of Springfield. And the initial area that was surveyed encompassed what is today the towns of Brimfield, Munson, Holland, Wales, and I think Warren as well. It never did get settled. They delayed, and ultimately it wasn't until 1731 that they came out, and the town started really to develop by about 1735. And the people moved out from the Springfield area, and it was really relatively easy for them to settle in a new area because they could bring with them supplies, building materials, tools, and artisans from Springfield, an already settled community. So they built houses that were reminiscent of buildings that had been built in an English style, that is to say, a braced timber frame with posts and beams and lesser frame elements that were the skeleton of the building. It was sheathed in boards or in clapboards, weatherboarding, and the roof was sheathed with wooden shingles. And these were small houses, usually built around a central chimney, or perhaps in some instances with an end chimney. But chances are they were only 2 rooms on the first floor and maybe just a loft above. This was simply because there were not enough materials available. They had to be transported. The houses grew with the passage of time as the families were enlarged. And bear in mind now, you're moving into a building that has no central heat. It has no storm windows. It has no window screens. It has no indoor plumbing. It has no electricity. It certainly couldn't have been a very comfortable way to live. And yet,
How big would one of those buildings be? Let's say for a small family, a husband, wife, and a couple of kids.
it could have been perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet. I mean, they're really quite small. And there are remains of buildings of that size still extant in Brimfield. I think that the L on your neighbor's house, Paul Adams, was a 2-room house. I think that the back part of Jim Adams' house may have been one of these early little buildings. Certainly the house on the corner by, as Route 20 turns what used to be called Sulya's Corner, the house that was torn down just recently where they planned to build a brewery, that was an early house. The Freeman House up on the Brookfield Road, way out by the orchard, that has collapsed or caused them to collect. That was one of these early houses. They're very rare now, and if they do exist at all, they exist as part of a larger building.
Hey, let me ask you something. When they would pick the location for a house, I would imagine it would have to be near water so that they could not have to travel a great distance to get water to cook and bathe and so on and so forth.
Yeah, curiously enough, the first settlement was up on Tower Hill, and that certainly isn't near water, but that didn't last. I mean, they moved down to the center of town, where we are now, and that was within reasonable distance of Sherman Pond. And Brimfield has a notorious high water table, so you didn't have to dig very far to strike water. So they dug wells. They used either a well sweep, which is a long pole set on a post with a hinge, and that would lower the bucket on a rope down into the well, and then the leverage of the counterbalanced pole, you could bring it up. Or alternatively, you could use a windlass, turn a crank, and a roller would roll up the rope and bring up the bucket. Ultimately, people had pumps, but that wasn't until well into the 19th century.
All right, tell me something. How would they carry or transport water at the earliest people who settled here?
Buckets,
Made from wood
probably wooden buckets, yeah.
and what, lined with pitch or something else?
They were probably waterproof with pitch, or they were made so tightly that the joints were almost waterproof, and as long as they stayed wet, they would hold water. Later, towns mandated leather fire buckets as a means of maintaining a bucket brigade in case of a fire. So most homes had 1 or 2 leather buckets hung right by the door.
So is it your opinion that the first permanent settlement, obviously you said they tried to put one on Tower Hill Road,
Yeah.
but it actually moved into the center. Now, are we talking about, for example, where Route 20 is in that immediate area?
Yes, yeah.
So in the immediate area of, for example, the Brimfield Market and
Yeah.
the Congregational Church, it was somewhere in that area.
Yeah.
That's where people
Yeah.
settled. Would they typically group houses together, or were they dispersed into farm areas?
Well, they had to be dispersed into farm areas because farming was one of the sole provisions to get food to eat. So you couldn't have everybody clustered downtown, or if they were clustered downtown, they would have an outlying land that was a farmland. People had animals. They raised cattle, they raised pigs, they raised sheep. Uh, They had provision for the animals, either in pens or with rail fences around their property. There was a town pound where if animals.
Explain what that is.
Well, it's a place where if an animal gets loose, it would be recovered and impounded in the town pound. And there was one in the center of town, and then later they moved it up onto the Warren Road. And it was an enclosure usually built of stone.
And was there a fine if your animal kept getting loose? Was there some penalty involved
There
with that?
was a penalty, a fine, I can't tell you exactly what it was, but it was a deterrent to careless animal husbandry.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned how these houses were constructed. What were they sheathed with? What were the roofs sheathed with to prevent rain and snow from
Wood
getting in?
shingles.
Wood shingles.
Wood shingles, because they discovered early on that the thatch roof, which had been a traditional roofing material in England, just wouldn't stand up to New England winters.
So these shingles we're talking about, are they similar to like a wood shake? Would they be thicker on one side?
Thicker on
thinner?
one end and taper down, and the period shingles were generally probably as much as 3 feet long, because they would overlap two courses. So, and of course stagger the joints, and they would be put on with nails, which at that time had to be handmade.
Okay. Now, you and I obviously spent some time preparing for this, and one of the things that emerged as a central theme with these small early houses was the efficiency or lack of efficiency of the heating system. Is it my memory that in the earliest days, they used to literally leave a hole in the top, like the top of the roof, ceiling rather, to let smoke out?
I think that's true, but I think it's fairly primitive, and I'm not sure that by the 1730s, 40s, 50s, I'm sure I'd rather suspect that they built a fully developed chimney. But the thing that was inefficient was the size of the fireplace. It was big, it was deep, and it had fairly straight sides, fairly straight jambs. And so the fire was way in the back of the firebox. That meant that most of the heat went right up the chimney, and not much of it got out into the room. And as the 18th century progressed, by the 1780s and 90s, what was called the Rumford style fireplace became popular. Count Rumford, although born in Massachusetts, was a colonist, was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, which made him unpopular with the people around here. So he went back to England, got himself a countship, and called himself Count Rumford. But the fact remains that he was a very clever and knowledgeable inventor, and what he invented was a more economical and more functional fireplace with widely splayed jambs, and with the back of the fireplace brought forward. So that, in effect, moved the fire more out into the room. And with the passage of time, the next progress was a fire frame, which was a cast iron unit with splayed jambs and an iron back, and the fire was built inside that, so it was literally on the hearth and into the room, so it radiated heat from the metalwork as much as from the firebox. The next step after that was a stove, and these first stoves started to be prevalent. There was a foundry down in Connecticut, I think in Torrington or Woodstock, where they cast iron stoves. These were efficient because the heat wasn't allowed to go out the chimney without radiating through the ironwork of the stove, and that was a more efficient use of wood. But you have to bear in mind that by the first decade of the 19th century, that would be 1800, 1810, this area was almost deforested because one could make money by taking cartloads of wood to Boston, where there was an insatiable need for firewood. And so it was incumbent on everyone to find the most efficient ways of heating. Now, as far as heating goes, wood was a solution until coal came in as an alternative, with the advent of Pennsylvania coal coming up to Providence and then coming up the Blackstone Canal to Worcester. And it was transported out here to Brimfield, where I'm sure that people that could afford it bought coal and burned it in their stoves.
Through these different generations of improvements in the original fireplace design and then the use of metal backings and fronts and so forth, is it fair to say that, given the weather, 5-month winters and so forth we have here, that the larger houses that eventually developed, some of which are still in existence now, where L's started to be built off of them because they could be heated more efficiently?
That's right, yeah.
Would you say that was kind of a primary reason for the enlargement of the buildings?
In part it was, but I think other things enter into it. Larger families, sometimes you have several generations living in one house. A display of wealth.
Show off.
Show off. Yeah, people became proud and they wanted to put up a good front, and so that's when you started getting these central chimney 2-story houses with 9 windows in the facade. Oftentimes, at least in this area, a feature of the Connecticut River Valley was to have a double front door, 2 doors. There's one house up on the Brookfield Road, way up on the curve, that still has that facade. I think that the house where Robert Cheney lives, where John and Jessica Scammell lived 50 years ago, that had originally 2 doors, but the house was modernized by putting in a single door with vertical side lights on either side, which was a feature of the federal style.
All right. We talked about heat and improving systems. Now, how did they, from the earliest times, let's talk about how these people that were originally in Brimfield lit their building.
Well, I think originally the earliest light source were candles, either dipped candles or molded candles. They were made from tallow, and of course you got tallow from every animal that you cooked. There was a certain amount of grease that could be skimmed off, and that was stored until it was time to make candles. Candle making was a domestic activity for the most part. The wives did it, and they either used candle molds and braided the wick into the mold, and then poured the candles in. You could get a mold that would make 4, 6, 8, or a dozen candles, or they dipped them. And dipped candles really took longer to make, but they took longer to burn away. They dipped a layer at a time and let it cool and harden. The next thing that came after candles were whale oil lamps. Whale oil was expensive, and it was increasingly more difficult to come by. So a variety of burning fluids, sort of generically called camphene, came into being, and this was a mixture of distilled turpentine and alcohol. And there were all variations on the extent of the one ingredient or the other. And camphene burned with a bright white light. It had to use a certain kind of a burner, usually a tubular burner. It also exploded, which is a disadvantage.
That would be
bad
problem,
news.
wouldn't it?
Yeah. So the best thing to come along was kerosene, and that didn't come along until the middle of the 1850s, when they struck oil down in Pennsylvania. And at first they used oil mostly for medicinal purposes, But the coal oil, they called it, uh, really was a universal fuel. And until the advent of electricity, which was in 1914 here in Brimfield, uh, people burned kerosene, coal oil.
The very earliest settlers, I remember during early discussions setting this up, uh, pretty much went to bed with the sunset
Yeah,
and were up with the dawn.
yeah, yeah.
And they really, I think the earliest settlers probably didn't even have candles.
Well, no, they may have used rushlights, which were rushes grow in a damp place. It's a fibrous, uh, tubular stalk, and when those are dried out and dipped in tallow, they would burn a rushlight holder. It was a little wooden clamp that would hold it at an angle, and it would burn not for a very long time, but it was free. It was economically feasible. But again, I think your point is well taken, that people really didn't stay up late.
Okay. Talk about the type of furniture you could expect in the various generations of home, beginning with the earliest ones.
Well, most of the furniture was probably made at home. So it was rustic, it was crude, uh, wooden, wooden seats. Sometimes they would be carved out to be comfortable. Uh, Sometimes the legs and the spools, the stretchers, would be turned if one had access to a lathe. Uh, Bureaus, desks, uh, were very simple, usually painted and not carved elaborately. Uh, as time passed, uh, furniture may have been made, there may have been resident cabinet makers in town who earned a living supplying furniture. Again, that was often in a style, although generic in an overall sense, uh, usually in a style peculiar to that one cabinet maker's skill and taste, so that a person who is very familiar with furniture of that period can say, oh, that's from the Connecticut River Valley, that's from the Boston area, that's from Newport. Uh, that depends really on how stylish it is.
All right. How were they paying, when people were farmers, for example, I'm sure that they were hunting from the forest as
Yeah.
well, maybe trapping uh, to get pelts and so forth, fishing in
Yeah.
the various lakes and streams, uh, and obviously farming. Uh, Talk a little bit about, how they would generate income to buy things. In other words, were
Okay.
they selling where were they selling vegetables, pelts and so forth?
Well, they were selling pelts probably to traveling tradesmen who came seasonally to purchase the pelts that had been harvested. Uh, they were dealing in pounds, shillings, and pence until after the Revolution, which made it a little more difficult to calculate. Um, the animals were, for the most part, owned by the farmers, and they would be butchered at home, and all the parts saved to be used in one way or another.
How would they do that without refrigeration?
Pickle it.
Describe that process briefly.
Well, put it down with salt. So you get salt pork, salt beef, which would mean you'd have to boil the daylights out of it to get the salt all out of it. But at least that preserved it, but it didn't preserve it indefinitely. Root crops could be preserved in the basement in a what do we call it?
Like a root cellar.
A root cellar, exactly. And
And that would mainly be sand, right?
it would be
As
sand.
opposed to loam or,
Yeah, yeah, it would be dry, and those would be things like carrots, rutabagas, beets, things that grew underground. Things that grew above ground just were seasonal, they were perishable.
like corn, for example, if you were trying to preserve that, would they strip the stalks, or would they preserve the whole stalk with the corn on it?
I'm not sure that corn could be preserved. I think that if they did, it would have to be, the stalk with the corn, the ear would have to be dried.
Okay,
And then, as we do today with dry corn, you can soak it and cook it.
Hmm.
But the diets were certainly not as diverse as we enjoy today. And the fish was whatever was available in Sherman Pond or in the Quabog River.
all right, so is it fair to say that during the winter, a lot of families probably were hungry?
Yes,
And,
as well as being cold.
yeah, and cold on top of it. So I would expect, for example, they would hunt when they could, certainly deer and whatnot that are in the forest. And I'm sure they may have fished through the ice,
Yeah,
uh, and used traps as much as they could. But this business of storing root cellars and whatnot must have been a big part of a family surviving a
exactly.
winter.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, that always begs the question of what happens to people who, for one reason or another, can't farm. They're too old, they have disabilities. I don't want to imply that they're lazy, but let's just say you have someone who just can't get his act together and doesn't lay in a stock. What happened to them in the winter?
Well, if they didn't have family to care for them, that is to say children, or other relatives, sometimes they wound up in the village poor farm.
Where was that located?
Well, there's the village poor farm that I know of is at the foot of Haynes Hill Road,
Where it meets Route 19?
where it meets Route 19.
Huh.
And people would go there, and those that could work would contribute to the well-being of the community by either preparing food or sweeping floors or making beds or doing whatever they were capable of doing.
Let me interrupt you. Do you mean that they would, for example, leave the poorhouse during the day, morning and go to a house?
No, no, no. I'm saying that they would help keep the poor farm shipshape.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know if they were hiring any people out from
No,
there?
I don't know, and I think that would be, there's a certain inherent pejorative thing in hiring people out from the poor farm. In other words, it's almost exploitive.
Okay,
It would seem to me, that would be my feeling.
yeah,
Yeah.
I can understand that. But essentially, who was supplying food to the poorhouse?
The poorhouse raised its own food,
Okay,
and that was the way some of the inhabitants would earn their keep by harvesting the vegetables or doing, whatever needed to be done to.
taking care of animals and
Yeah,
so
exactly.
forth, huh? Okay, that's interesting. But that poorhouse was at the base of Haynes Hill Road, right where it meets Route 19.
Yeah.
Right in that area
Yeah.
there. Do you know specifically where it was?
Well, it was on the south side of Haynes Hill Road, and it was the first house on the left up the hill.
Is it still there?
It's still there,
Wow.
and there's a big barn there.
Huh. All right, and how many people would typically be in there? I am sure it would vary, but what would you think for a town the size of this one?
This is a complete guess. I'm saying maybe a dozen or so.
Okay. All right, now, yeah, we talked about fireplaces. We're not really digressing. We're kind of trying to get down a path. How would people actually start a fire back then?
With flint and steel and a tinderbox. And tinderbox is what it sounds like. It's a box, usually of tin, and it has in it flammable materials that would respond quickly to a spark struck by a piece of steel.
For example, what would the flammable materials?
Uh,
Like dry straw,
Dry
wood
straw,
shavings?
wood shavings, cotton, uh, even dried crumbled leaves. I mean, anything that is dry and ready to burn.
So they
And-
take a piece of steel
Yeah,
and strike it
strike it on a piece of stone.
right across the flint,
Yeah,
and that would generally cast a spark
yeah,
off into this tinderbox.
yeah.
And it would start smoldering and then eventually break into flaming fire. And then they'd move that to, for example, a fireplace that had been prepared ahead of time.
Right.
With kindling and dry materials that would become ignited first, and, so
But
forth.
the real trick is to not let the fire go out.
Yeah.
Fires were maintained, they were banked in the evening, and that's how they would heat things like this. This is a piece of soapstone, and it would be heated and then put into a coal bed to warm the bed up.
Now, they would put that, what, in the fireplace?
Not in the fireplace, but
Right
just in
next to
front
it.
of it, like that, in front of it, and it would
Yeah.
absorb the heat, and then it would be moved carefully with cloths around it.
Could I see that?
Yeah.
Now, tell me, where would they get soapstone?
Much of it came from Vermont, and I suppose they would buy it at a general store in town. That's a small one. They come twice that size, and many of them have an iron handle set into them so that you can move them around. But that's an important accessory.
Or they let the dog sleep on the bed was another thing.
That's right, right.
All right, and in terms of like bed coverings, you had another device here that is, can you briefly go into that?
Yeah.
I think we're running a bit long.
This is what's called a bed wrench. And beds were a basic frame into which there were holes all through the bed rails and the foot rails, and ropes would be strung through, and they would make a network that would be supportive of the mattress. And in time, of course, the ropes would sag, so the bed wrench would be placed down between the rail and the rope, and it would be turned, and as it tightened the rope up, you would drive a wooden peg in to lock the rope in place. And from that came the old phrase of sleep tight, which was far more comfortable than sleeping loose. Sleep tight, but don't let the bed bugs bite. And that's a phrase that still is popular. People still use it, but they don't place what it means to say sleep tight.
All right, this is an actual,
That's an actual bed wrench, yeah.
okay, how old do you think this is?
It's hard to say. Things like that, I suppose, are anywhere from late 18th to first half of the 19th century. In fact, people were sleeping in rope beds as late as the Civil War. A lot of changes came about in the middle of the 19th century as a consequence of what's called the Industrial Revolution. Now, here's another utensil that most people wouldn't know what it is. It's a sugar nibbler, and it was designed and intended to cut sugar. Sugar came in either conical shapes or called loaves of sugar wrapped in blue paper. You'd buy it it came up from the Caribbean, and you'd buy it at the general store. And then when you wanted some, you would use this to snip a piece off, and either that could be dropped into your tea, or alternatively, you could granulate it in a mortar and pestle. If you're working around the fireplace, this would be a necessary utensil. This is a pot lifter or a kettle lifter, because those handles would get just as hot as the contents, and you wouldn't want to grab it by hand. You'd put this under the handle and lift it off that way.
Could I see that one?
Sure.
Now, this is a remarkable piece of metal. It's not welded anywhere, rather it appears to be made from a single piece of metal
Yeah.
by a blacksmith.
Yeah.
And it's bent in a manner, you see, a very intricate manner. This is remarkable. To
Yeah.
me, this is a remarkable piece of craftsmanship.
It's
To
nice.
be able to bend is this steel or iron?
It's iron,
Iron,
yeah, wrought iron,
yeah. So the melting temperature of something like this is in the area of 1,700 degrees.
yeah,
So you'd be working with, what, a red hot molten metal,
yeah,
pounding it on an anvil,
yeah,
and then bending it while it's superheated.
Yeah.
And it's almost like semi-liquid,
yeah.
bending it in this manner. Look at this, as smooth as this, whoever made this was very, very good at their
Oh.
trade, weren't they, huh?
They surely were.
So the idea was to lift the pot with this and keep your hands away
From the hot
handle.
metal,
Yeah,
yeah.
interesting. Very, very good.
My last prop, if you will, is, it's something that still is used today. The name curling iron is carried for it, but this really is a piece of iron used for curling hair. It would be heated and then put into the lock of hair, the curl, and turned until the heat had set the hair, and then it would be removed. And this too is iron, it's wrought iron, and again, another skillful piece of handcraft, handwork. And this dates, I think at least from the 1800 period. So we were,
And mainly, women would be curling their hair.
yeah,
Certainly not I wouldn't, no. Okay. You know, we talked about heating homes. What about in the dead of summer? How were they cooling these houses?
they opened the windows, and that was before there were screens. So that meant that every insect in Christendom would come into your house because it smelled good. And it smelled not only of food, but of body odors and insects like that. So it would not be a pleasant experience to live in the house. The window screens didn't really appear until the early 19th century, let's say 1820, 1825, and at that time they were merely a wooden frame with a cloth screen, a loose mesh cloth tacked into the frame. The first screens were, of course, woven iron, and they rusted out. Then later copper screens came in, and today's screens are aluminum and far more permanent.
Okay. We touched upon what every household in Brimfield would have in the way of implements. Talk a little bit about what would you expect every household would have in the way of farm animals?
Well, I think they'd have a cow for milk. Not everybody could afford a horse, but it would be a wonderful thing to have if you were transporting things that you had to sell. Sheep were raised not only for food, but they were shorn, and the wool was carded and woven into a fabric. And this was done at home. There were, in some communities, carding mills where you would take your wool to be carded. Carding means that it is goes through wire wheels that take out all of the burrs and all of the stuff that the sheep had collected over the year by rolling around in the dirt. Other utensils on the farm would be basic agricultural tools: rakes, hoes, shovels, a plow. They might have a mule. They might have a horse. They might borrow a horse or loan a mule. I think one thing that we need to also consider is the fact that many activities in a town the size of Brimfield were communal things, where everybody helped to get the hay in if there was a storm coming. Everybody helped to raise the barn or helped to put up a house under the guidance of a skilled housewright or a skilled carpenter. People would certainly join together to help put out a fire. The town was defended by a militia. These militia could take the form of an enrolled militia. That meant all the men of a certain age would appear on muster day, which occurred in the spring or in the fall, May or September, or a volunteer militia such as the Brimfield Rifle Company. And that was founded in 1828. Alfred Hitchcock, who was a shoemaker, just a few doors down here, was a member of the Brimfield Rifle Company.
What was their function?
They were, uh, they were volunteers, which meant that they were more, uh, more willing to participate than the guys who were enrolled and told to be there or else. And they usually wore a uniform, whereas the enrolled militia wore their street clothes. So it was a matter of pride, and they could be assigned to a state regiment or a state division. So the volunteer militia was very popular and lasted up through Civil War times.
So they actually would defend Brimfield in the event of an invasion, and back then there were problems, of course, with Native Americans and with French, different.
Well, that's before the period we're
Right,
covering.
but I'm just saying,
Yeah,
you know, in the event of some type of an invasion,
yeah,
they would join together,
yeah,
form, and go out and.
yeah. I think the important thing that it really was a closely knit community in that people collaborated one with another on many different activities.
Okay, yeah, and we were, getting back to the household again, I suppose, we have to touch upon how people maintained, sanitation, clean their hands, before handling food, that, you know, all the way through the whole regimen.
Well, I think sanitation, as we look at it today, was an alien concept at that time. People may have taken a sponge bath once a week, and it may have been a communal thing that the kids got in the tub last, and the older people used it first. So it wasn't fresh water by any means. People didn't understand the medical knowledge was very limited. So the understanding of the germ factor wasn't. People didn't know about that. Medicine was empirical. People apprenticed to doctors, and so whatever bad practice that doctor conveyed, you carried it forward for another generation. So that it's hard to say how often bedding was changed. It's hard to say. People did sweep their floors. They sanded their floors. Sometimes they swept the sand into a pattern, a decorative pattern. And of course that absorbed all the slops that were spilled carrying food around, or whatever animals may have done in the house. So I think that the concept of cleanliness was there, but not to the extent that it is today, by any means.
Yeah. You know, I have a house that dates only from 1853, and in the back of this house, which has a barn attached to the rear of it, there is a 3-hole privy with no privacy curtains.
Yeah,
Just 3 toilet seats.
yeah,
And when I bought the house from Crawford Lincoln, who was the president of Old Sturbridge Village, and his wife Ann, my wife and I, you know, that was, he brought us around and showed us these different curiosities, if you will. But that actually was still intact, including the chute
yeah.
that was below it, the wooden chute, and there was a metal bucket that with a with a cord on it. I never saw that because but Crawford told me it was there at one point, where people would pull it out in the morning and burn it in the field and then put it back. And that was how the bathroom situation. And there's also a very unique little stove down, well, it's not really a stove, it's more of it's a brickwork, and it has a very deep, as far as I can see, copper, like a big, probably about, you know, almost 2 feet by 2 feet, maybe 2 feet deep. it's a metal, like a bucket, with a pure copper top, okay? And this is over a firebox, so it had its own chimney. And what he told me was that they used to wash clothes by boiling them in lye.
Mm-hmm. Boiling them with lye.
Would,
Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
that would, how often would they do something like that?
Well, again, I think that probably at the end of the winter, they'd wash the winter clothes.
Okay,
I don't think it was a weekly thing, but people had their own lye stones where they put the ashes from hardwood fires, that is to say, the fires that were used to heat the bake ovens, and they would save those, they would put them in a barrel with holes drilled in the bottom of the barrel on top of a lye stone, which is generally a circular stone with a groove all around the perimeter and then a little mouth at one end. And the rainwater would leach the pearl ash out of this, would leach the lye out of the ash, and it would be collected, and that would be used to make soap or to clean as well.
all right, on a different subject, education was important to the first people here, if only to read the Bible, right? I mean,
Right.
that was really one of the main things
Yeah.
that people were taught to read, so they could read the Bible. And so schools were set up fairly early in New England communities and in Brimfield.
Well, in Brimfield, initially, the schools were held in private homes, and the town hired one schoolmaster who would travel at intervals from one house to another, different areas of the town, and he would generally stay for 3 weeks at a time, and then he would travel to the next community. That lasted for some time until they decided that they would build a school, and I think they started in 1741. And it wasn't until 1745 that it was finished, and it was near the church. Well, first it was going to be near the church, but later was up on the Warren Road. And people, I guess, went as they could. Kids were expected to help out with the chores, and the schooling was important, but when it came time to do the harvesting, the kids had better damn well be there. And the schools, people of all ages were in one room, which meant that the younger children sometimes learned from older children. It was a system that worked, although as the town grew more and more, they had to have divided up into regions, and there are still a couple small schoolhouses, one up on Tower Hill.
You and I visited that.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few months ago.
Yeah.
So is that the only one left in town?
It's the only one that I know of. There used to be another one down on Route 20 where it was where the granite, infinite granite place is. It was on that hill. And that was torn down. Well, it was torn down while I've lived in Brimfield, but I can remember when it was still there.
How many schools were they, these small schools, at its peak?
I think there were 8, but I'm not sure.
Now, how many post offices were there?
There was just one.
I thought there was another one down by Old Palmer Road. I heard there were several at one time.
Well,
But in any case, these one-room schoolhouses all had professional teachers or people who had some training?
people who had some training, they were predominantly men, although there were some female school teachers. Depending upon the behavior of the students, some teachers stayed longer than others. But it was,
Were these schools free?
yes,
So it didn't cost the families anything to
no,
send?
no.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, when they finally went into the Hitchcock Academy,
Yeah,
that was what, around just before the Civil War?
yeah, yeah.
Our understanding was that our house, the house that I live in presently, was a dormitory for girls
Mm-hmm.
that lived on the outskirts of Brimfield that would attend. And that may account for that three-hole property in
That's
the
right.
back of the house, that the rooms were filled with young women
Yeah,
who lived there. We were told that several times. Um, and that's an interesting thing, that they were brought in by horseback evidently on like Sunday night, so they could start their class at the proper time
Monday morning.
and then they were picked up Friday
yeah,
after the class was let out,
yeah,
you know. Uh, and that was just before the Civil War.
Yeah.
So they was, okay. And do you know anything about town festivals or recreation here in Brimfield?
well, really,
Back then, early
until,
times.
till the time of the Civil War, uh, the chief holiday was the 4th of July. People in the 18th and early 19th century didn't really celebrate Christmas. Christmas was just another day. With the advent of the arrival of Episcopalians, particularly they were in Connecticut more than in this state, they started to celebrate Christmas. Certainly German immigrants brought with them Christmas practices, but Christmas trees really weren't in evidence at all until the 1850s, probably 40s or 50s. And then it was very localized, and depending upon your religious background or your ethnic heritage.
Okay, that's interesting. So they'd have a festival on the 4th of July.
Yeah.
What was the festival like? What would happen here?
I suppose there would be a parade. I suppose that there would be a reading of the Declaration of Independence. Certainly the town, someone of the town fathers or the clergymen would speak. I don't think there would be a lot of fireworks. I don't think there would be the kind of 4th of July that we look forward to.
All right, yeah, that brings us to another subject. When people wanted to relax at night after a hard day's work, were they creating apple hard cider and that
Oh
sort
yeah,
of thing?
hard cider was popular. One could make rum from molasses. You could buy the molasses at the general store. In fact, by the 1830s, your local general store was probably carrying in barrels various potent drinks that they would sell you by whatever the container was you brought in to fill. Yeah.
Would some of the people, do you know if we had a general store here in Brimfield?
I don't know if we did. I don't know where it was, and I don't know who ran it. But it's hard to believe that there wasn't a general store where people could buy some of the things that could not be grown or raised locally. And these would be things like tea, sugar, flour, some textiles, certainly some worked metal. Now there would be a local blacksmith certainly and a local farrier, but by the end of the 18th century, cast iron hardware was being imported extensively from England, and so I think that the stores would handle things like that in limited quantities, or people would have to go to Palmer or to Sturbridge.
All right, so people who were skilled carpenters you would have one or more of them, you'd have a tailor, you'd have blacksmiths.
Yeah,
These things would support local populations, you'd probably have to doctor. Farriers, huh?
there
Coming
is, well,
through.
people who shoot horses,
Masons,
yeah.
can you think of anything else that would typically be in a town this size?
Well, certainly clergymen. Dr. Joseph Moffat, who lived in the house I live in, was a doctor for 40 years in Brimfield. I think that about covers it. There may have been, well, there was a shoemaker, and in fact, shoemaking in many towns in central Massachusetts became a very big, profitable manufacturing, and they sold shoes to distributors who then took them to major cities, and they sold, made boots for the army.
All right. All right, John, I think that covers our outline.
Good.
I think you did a tremendous job.
Well,
I
thank
really
you.
appreciate this on behalf of the citizens of this town. Can you think of anything else you'd like to add?
I think I've probably said as much as I should say.
All right, good. This finishes this interview, and thank you for watching.